This is the Discontinuity Thesis, a 7-part series on why AI breaks the wage-demand circuit that post-war capitalism depends on. Written by Ben Liurongs. Episode 5: Categorical Recursion. The question in this episode is why category-based AI regulation keeps chasing the wrong object. There is a class of regulatory failure our existing names blur. It is not capture, it is not arbitrage in the ordinary sense, it is not lag. It is the specific failure mode that occurs when the act of regulating an object causes the economic deployment of that object to mutate into an adjacent legal category that the regulation does not cover. Call it categorical recursion. It is the deep mechanism beneath every governance proposal that tries to preserve the wage-demand circuit by governing AI as a legal object, and it is why those proposals fail in ways their authors find surprising. Here is the core observation: AI is not one legal object, it is 5 at once. It is productivity software, it is capital equipment, it is labor substitute, it is strategic infrastructure, it is recursive R&D engine. The same model deployed by the same firm in the same week occupies all 5 categories simultaneously, not sequentially, not depending on use case, at once. A frontier model used to draft a contract is productivity software to the lawyer, capital equipment on the firm's balance sheet, labor substitute to the paralegal who will not be hired, strategic infrastructure to the state hosting the data center, recursive R&D engine to the lab training the next version. The categories are not chosen by the regulator, they are inhabited by the object. The ambiguity is not rhetorical, it is ontological. Each face is fully true. The model really is software, it really is capital, it really is replacing future hires, it really is part of national compute infrastructure, it really is part of the next R&D loop. None of these descriptions is misleading. All of them are simultaneously available as legal economic identities. This is not a feature of bad regulation, it is a feature of the technology. Within the legal categorical paradigm, selecting a category is the first thing a regulator must do. Law operates on legal objects. Legal objects are categorical. The EU AI Act regulates AI systems by risk tier. Export controls regulate compute by capability threshold. Procurement rules regulate vendors by contract type. Liability frameworks regulate harms by causation chain. Each of these is a category selection act. The selection commits the regulator to a definition. The definition becomes the surface against which the deployed object moves. The object does not need to evade the definition, it only needs to inhabit a different one of its 5 faces. Regulate AI as labor substitution, and the firm reframes deployment as productivity software. Regulate it as software, and the state reframes it as strategic infrastructure exempt under national security. Regulate it as a weapon, and the developer reframes it as cloud productivity. Regulate frontier training, and the diffusion happens through smaller open-weight models inside ordinary workflows. Regulate deployment, and the firm reframes the system as assistance with human oversight. Regulate assistance, and the boundary with ordinary software collapses. At no point in this sequence does any actor need to break a law, the object simply presents a different face. The clearest case study is the EU AI Act. It is explicitly category-based. The legal architecture itself creates the migration paths: provider, deployer, downstream integrator, fine-tuner, open-source releaser, enterprise customer, systemic risk model. These are not merely compliance labels, they are available legal identities. Once obligations attach to one identity, value migrates through the others. The Commission's own enforcement guidance, non-binding but revealing of the enforcement architecture, confirms this. Most fine-tuning, adaptations, and minor modifications do not automatically create new model provider obligations unless the modification crosses a high threshold, defined as more than 1/3 of the original model's training compute. Open-source treatment receives different obligations from commercial release, though this exemption does not apply to general-purpose AI models with systemic risk. Downstream integrators inherit obligations differently from upstream providers. Each of these distinctions is reasonable in isolation. Each is a doorway in aggregate. A model whose direct deployment as a high-risk system would attract heavy obligations can be released, modified, integrated, or wrapped through adjacent roles whose obligations attach differently. A general-purpose capability can be decomposed across models, wrappers, tools, integrations, and workflows whose individual components may sit below the most visible threshold, forcing the regulator to reconstruct systemic function after deployment rather than identify it cleanly before. This is the essential point. The regulator did not create loopholes. The regulator created categories, which is what regulators must create. The object moves between them because the object is the kind of thing that exists in all of them at once. The recursion is what makes this novel. In conventional regulatory arbitrage, the regulated party finds a workaround, the regulator updates the rule, the workaround closes. The cat-and-mouse equilibrium is unstable but bounded. Regulation is always somewhat behind, but it is not categorically defeated. Categorical recursion is different. The act of regulating a face of the object is itself a market signal. It tells every firm in the ecosystem which face is currently being scrutinized, which means every firm has an immediate incentive to redescribe its deployment under one of the other four faces. The regulation does not just fail to catch the object. The regulation creates a market signal and an incentive for migration. This is not a slow process. It happens at the speed of a press release. The regulator's next move is to broaden the definition. The market's next move is to inhabit a face not yet defined. The regulator's third move is to attempt a comprehensive framework. The market's third move is to invoke the multi-category arbitrage problem as evidence that comprehensive frameworks are unworkable. The regulator loses not because the regulator is slow. The regulator loses because the regulator is operating on the wrong substrate. Categories cannot enclose objects whose economic deployment selects its category in response to enclosure. It is tempting to read this as a sophisticated form of regulatory capture. It is not. Capture requires that the regulated party influences the regulator's preferences or rules. Categorical recursion requires no such influence. It operates even against a perfectly honest, perfectly well-resourced, perfectly motivated regulator. The mechanism is structural. The regulator's instrument is the legal category. The deployed object's response surface is the same legal category. The object does not need to corrupt the regulator. It only needs to be the kind of thing that can be five things at once. Capture is a problem of incentives. Categorical recursion is a problem of ontology. The model itself does not literally evade. The neural network is stable. Weights do not change to escape regulation. The thing that moves is not the technical substrate. It is the legal economic wrapper around the substrate: provider, customer, tool, service, infrastructure, research artifact, fine-tune, agent, workflow, API, internal system, open weight derivative. The object does not evade as software, it evades as capital. Its technical substrate is stable enough to be deployed. Its legal economic identity changes depending on where regulation attaches. This identifies the real target. The thing being regulated is not AI as a technical object, it is AI as capital in motion. The motion is the thing the categories cannot hold. Let me bring together the within-face and across-face problems. The Sorites problem from the previous episode is that within any single face of the object, there is no clean line between assistance and replacement. Spellcheck to autocomplete to draft generation to autonomous composition is one continuous gradient. Categorical recursion adds a second axis of ungovernability. Even if a regulator solved the within-face Sorites problem, the across-face migration problem remains. The two axes interact. Within-face Sorites makes every face individually ungovernable. Across-face recursion makes the choice of face arbitrary. Together, they exhaust the regulatory surface. This is why governance proposals that work on paper fail on contact. The paper version assumes a stable object presenting a stable face along a stable gradient. The deployed version is none of those things. Any proposed governance regime aimed at preserving the wage-demand circuit must survive 6 failure modes simultaneously: state defection, where one major actor refuses the regime; firm-level evasion, where commercial actors reclassify deployments; open-weight diffusion, where capability spreads below the regulatory threshold; individual workflow adoption, where 8 billion users make daily tool choices the regime cannot observe; category arbitrage, where the deployed object migrates to a face the regime does not cover; the assistance replacement gradient, where SORYETs within a face dissolves the regulated distinction. A regime that fails any one of these fails as a defense of the wage-demand circuit. The thesis is narrow. It says the wage-demand circuit cannot be defended by category-based instruments, not that all regulation is futile. The implication is structural. The wage-demand circuit collapse is not a failure of regulation. It is what happens when the substrate of regulation is mismatched to the substrate of the regulated object. A regulator who understands categorical recursion has 2 options: attempt comprehensive coverage across all 5 faces, which requires definitional precision and cross-domain coordination that no existing institution can deliver, and which itself becomes the market signal triggering the next mutation. Or abandon category-based regulation and attempt outcome-based regulation, which requires defining the outcome to be prevented, which returns the problem to definition, which returns the problem to category. There is no third option that operates within the legal categorical paradigm. The paradigm is the constraint. What sits outside the paradigm is not regulation, it is something else: direct ownership of the compute layer, mandatory wage share redistribution from automation gains, public deployment with non-market allocation rules. These are not regulations, they are structural interventions that operate on the underlying flow of value rather than on the deployed object. Whether any of these is politically achievable is the next question. The point of this episode is to establish that the regulatory question, as conventionally posed, has been answered. The economic deployment of the object moves when you look at it. The looking causes the moving. No legal categorical instrument survives the recursion. Regulation attaches to manifestations. Capital moves through relations. The mismatch is the failure. That is episode 5 of the Discontinuity Thesis. The full essay, transcript and citations are at unitcostdominance.com. Next, the successor system: why consumption can be saved without saving the circuit.